Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. My name is Chelsea Honeysett. I'm a PhD scholar with Sharon and Desh at the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse at ANU. I'm also the government relations specialist there, so have been absolutely loving the election season. It's my favorite time of the election cycle. It's my Super Bowl, so lots to chat about and lots to digest. We've had some really big results come through. Obviously, even though we had a stay in government, we've had some big leadership changes. We've had a significant mandate for the Labor Party, which is a huge deal. The maintenance of the Teals in our election cycle. So what we're aiming to do with this session today is really digest a lot of that, talk about a lot of the big policy issues that were on the table throughout the election, and have a chat with our esteemed panel to really digest and understand how the election cycle and the policies committed are impacting what we use as planetary health equity framing. For those of you who don't know us, but are interested in the work that we do, we're obviously the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse. We're based in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at ANU. And we're really focused on governance issues related to three major and interconnected challenges: a rising public health burden, social inequity, and climate change. The work that we do is really looking to provide a roadmap towards planetary health equity, and the aim is to drive positive change through idea generation and informed action in policy and business. So the cross-section of the political cycle, the election, and all of the expertise and research that we do should give us a bit of a sense of where planetary health equity is going. What we're going to do in terms of the format today is we're going to start, each of our panelists is going to have about 5 to 7 minutes to kind of talk about the key policy areas that they were monitoring through this year's election. I'm going to have a chance to pick their brains on some of the issues that I think are really interesting, and then we're going to go over to audience questions. So please start thinking about those, start putting them in the chat, but we'll come back to it soon enough. So what we might do, I thought, is start with Christian Downey. Professor Downey is in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at ANU with us, where he's the director of the Governing Energy Transition Lab. Take it away, Christian.
Thanks, Chelsea, and good afternoon, everyone. So I thought I might just say a little bit about what it means for climate and energy policy after the election. As Chelsea said, I guess what was a surprise to most commentators and most of us was perhaps the size of Labor's victory. I think they've got the largest, I think they're up to 94 seats now in the lower house. So that's, I think, the largest caucus since Federation. So a huge election victory for the Labor Party and for the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. Now, for any election, there's a whole range of reasons that'll be debated about why they won and why other parties lost. But I think many folk agree that one issue was climate and energy policy, particularly the coalition's approach to nuclear to decarbonise our electricity grid versus the Labor Party's approach to renewables. So that's something I'll come back to. But I think to say that climate and energy policy did play a role in some of the elections, particularly in some seats and in the overall outcome. So what does it mean, Labor's victory for climate and energy policy in this country? Well, I think the first kind of thing at a very high level is that it means that there's a recommitment to net zero emissions by 2050. Both parties, or the coalition and the Labor Party, had both agreed to that, but clearly it's a stronger commitment from the Labor Party than it perhaps might have been from the coalition, especially given in recent weeks we've seen some members of the coalition arguing that the opposition should abandon net zero. So with the election victory, I think we can lock in a commitment. Now, I say that word, it's a rhetorical commitment, I guess, to net zero emissions by 2050. The challenging bit is, how do we get there? So Australia has a greenhouse gas target. We have a target of 43% emissions reductions by 2030. But I don't think we're going to get there unless there's a real change in pace. The government's projections assume that emissions are going to have to reduce quite sharply over the next few years from 2027 to 2030, because we've seen emissions flatline at about 28% reductions on 2005 levels for the last few years. So we're going to need a lot of heavy lifting over this decade if we're going to meet the existing target of 43% cuts. The other thing to note is most of you on this call will remember that Australia, like just about every country in the world, signed up to the Paris Agreement in 2015. And under the Paris Agreement, every country has to come up with a new greenhouse gas target this year, so a 2035 greenhouse gas target. So that means the government now has to set a new target. It had been putting that off till after the election, obviously for political reasons. So there's big questions, of course, what will that target be? The Climate Change Authority, which is an independent statutory body that provides advice to the government, before the election was suggesting that a greenhouse gas target for 2035 should be around about 65 to 75% reductions on emissions. So it will be interesting to see where the government goes in that direction, whether it heeds the advice of the Climate Change Authority or takes a different figure. So that's the target. So that's almost the easy bit, right? Setting the target. And then there's the policies that hopefully will get us there. As I mentioned at the outset, obviously this government's approach to decarbonising the energy sector is all about renewables, batteries and storage, hydro, and to some extent gas. It's not going down the nuclear pathway, which the coalition was promising. It put in place a range of policies in its last term to help us get there. There's the capacity investment scheme, for example, and it also announced other policies during the election campaign, like battery rebates for households, and I think other commercial premises. So clearly, there's a plan to double down on renewables, to provide incentives to increase battery uptake and the like. Now, the electricity target that the government has is 82% of renewable electricity by 2030. So 82% of our electricity should be generated by renewables by 2030. We're at about 40% or so now. I think it's just under 40%. So we're going to need new generation, new transmission, and of course, new storage. So it's going to be a huge task for the rest of this decade to get us there. Clearly, nuclear is not going to be a part of that. There was very good reasons why nuclear might not come online anyway, and I'm happy to talk about that more in question and Q&A, but I think we can rule nuclear out for the foreseeable future. The other part, and Chelsea cut me off, I think I've probably been talking for a few minutes, but cut me off here if I've... But the other part, I guess, to mention is what's known as FMIA, or the Future Made in Australia agenda. You probably heard the Prime Minister during the election talk a lot about Made in Australia and a future Made in Australia. This is essentially legislation that passed at the end of the last election. It's the government's approach, which is, you might characterize as green industry policy. During Biden administration in the US, they used to talk about strategic industry policy. But essentially, it's about providing subsidies and other supports to grow green industries. There's tax incentives for what's known as production tax credits for green hydrogen and green iron. I think just before the election, they announced that they'll extend that to green aluminium to try and incentivize green aluminium. I'd expect to see more in that space over the next 3 years. And I think we'll also, and I hope that we'll also see more in the finance space. So we have kind of colloquially what we might think of as green banks, like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, ARENA, and others. My hope would be that the government now doubles down on that and uses those agencies to really get the money and underwrite and crowd in private investment that we're going to need to make this transition happen. So I think we'll see further progress on climate policy under the Albanese government, but always the big question is going to be, do they have the political courage to put in place the policies that are going to get us close to what the climate science has been saying for a long time now that we need to do. And I've talked about what they might do and kind of the positive side, but there's some blind spots that we can also talk about in the Q&A around continued support for approvals of coal and gas mines. In particular, gas, I think, is the larger concern here. And we saw the announcement yesterday that the new Environment Minister, Murray Watt, has approved a new extension of a Woodside project off WA. So we can talk about all of that in the Q&A, but I think we'll see progress. But the key now is going to be, can the government raise its ambition to get closer to the climate targets that we're going to need to meet if we're going to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. And we're already seeing what it looks like in far New South Wales at the moment with the flooding. Thanks, Chelsea.
Thanks, Christian. And yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Labor have come in with this really convincing mandate, a lot of that being about promises to address climate change in a genuine way. And then one of the first things that happens is this extension of Woodside. So we'll definitely touch on that again, I'm sure. While I've got you just for a quick minute, I wanted to get your quick reflections on thoughts about Susan Lee and where she's sitting around climate now and potentially what that dynamic might look like.
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of crystal ball gazing with the coalition is a little bit difficult, right? I mean, they're a coalition today, they weren't yesterday, and they were a week ago. So with some trepidation to suggest what their climate policy might be going forward. I think it seems, and this is just from what we read, that the moderate faction within the Liberal Party has the numbers at the moment. So we might see then perhaps take a slightly better position on this issue, but there are let's say, vocal members of the backbench on both parties, both the Liberal Party and the National Party, that have been advocating for the coalition to ditch a commitment to net zero emissions. And I think, if that party can't agree to the very basics, then it's going to be hard for them to put in place material policies that will, drive the energy transition. And of course, net zero emissions was agreed to under the Scott Morrison government too. So at the very least, you would hope that the coalition takes an improved policy on what it had its last time it was in government.
Yes, indeed. Plenty more to discuss shortly. So next we're going to go over to Deska Dodrigal. He is a research fellow over at the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse with us and is also a political economist. Thanks, Desh.
Thank you, Chelsea. Yeah, so we're sitting here after about a month from the election. So I guess the question was, was it a really big stamp of approval by the Australian people of the Labor Party, which the landslide win suggests? But if you look at what happened, just a few days before in Canada, where the Liberal Party over there went from winning the election badly in the polls, losing the election badly in the polls, to winning almost a majority, I think. That context tells us that there were external events that impacted Australian election probably quite importantly. And so in many ways, if you also look at the primary votes of the parties, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, that tells you that it's not like a big stamp of approval of what the Albanese government has done. So in the context of the cost of living crisis that was going on, that's what it was called. It's the way the election was won in terms of the seats won seems like a big stamp of approval, but if you look at other things, perhaps not. Especially given that in terms of the rents, the way that the rents have increased in a tremendous way over the past couple of years suggests that when it comes to inequity and inequality, the government, the Labor government, has struggled to kind of cope with or to address that level of inequality. So I'm going to talk a bit more about inequity and some of the proposals in the elections that the Labor has brought forward, and what that might mean for inequity and inequality. So I'm going to touch on three things in particular. The first two I'm going to kind of breeze past, and the third one I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So the first one I'll touch on is super changes, and this is the one that's been making headlines recently as well. So there's a new tax. After a long time, I guess, there's been a new tax. Much needed, you have to say, right? And that's basically an additional tax rate of 15% on super earnings from any amount over 3 million in super accounts. So for basically that affects around 0.5% of people with super accounts. At this point, a big controversy around that is that there is no indexation that is built into that. And that means that 0.5% can keep growing. But there's an estimate showing that even if it remains the same, there's no indexation up to 2050, that would still mean only about 20% of the Australian super account holders would fall in that category. So, in that sense, I think it's Labor's bet to kind of rake in taxes through indexation in a way, which happened through bracket creep, in the past. That's been kind of one of the strategies that governments have used to get more tax. But in terms of its impact on inequity and inequality, I think this is one of the positives from the Labour government, in that it is something much needed tax revenue that will come in, and it will help it deal with a lot of the inequity issues. And relatedly, I guess, one of the promises that it made during the election, it will help fund that as well. And that's one of those promises, is allowing first-time home buyers to skip the mortgage insurance in the housing market, so that it's easier for a lot of people to get into the housing market in the first place. So that's been a perennial issue in Australian politics for a long time now. And so that will definitely help a lot of people get into the housing market, get their first home. So it's kind of a positive as well. But there's also a negative built into that, in the sense that in the long run, it's just going to keep raising house prices. So more people are going to get into the market, and it's just going to keep raising house prices. So it's kind of a mixed thing for me, at least. Now, the third thing I wanted to touch on is productivity. And so this is something, when I was watching the ABC News's coverage of the election, Jim Chalmers was one of the guests. And he said in that show, after the election was won, that the focus of this Labour government is going to be on productivity growth now, because productivity has flatlined for a number of years now. And the way that Chalmers put it is that in the first term of government, their eye was on inflation. So their focus was on inflation with an eye on productivity growth. But apparently this term, they're going to focus on productivity growth with an eye on inflation. So that's the way he put it. So clearly, the Labour government have made productivity growth their priority area. Now, what does that mean? So, and many things to think about productivity growth. So first, why is there a lack of productivity growth in Australia? Now, there's this literature on what is called corporate short-termism, which, besides, a lot of the technological reasons and so forth, and demographic reasons and so forth as well, what is called corporate short-termism has been shown to affect the lack of productivity growth. And that's because of a lack of innovation. So a lot of corporations, especially big corporations that are publicly listed, because they are pouring out so much of their profits to shareholders in the form of dividends, and especially share buybacks in the likes of the US, UK, and Australia, they have not been able to reinvest back into the company as much. And a lot of that means that there's less skills, less investment into research and development. And all of this then is linked to the lack of innovation and the lack of productivity growth as well. So this corporate short-termism is, in the academic literature at least, talked about quite a bit as one of the reasons that productivity growth is slowing down and flatlining. But it's not something that we've heard the parties talk about, right? And the other thing that parties have not talked about when it comes to corporations as well, and which a lot of reports have showed, is price gouging. So, a lot of, for example, Australia Institute has kind of pointed to price gouging as one of the reasons for inflation. And that's also something that wasn't talked about too much. Now, returning to productivity growth, briefly, I guess, in terms of time, what productivity growth, in terms of productivity growth, what it can also mean is that when there is productivity growth, that often creates, of course, to produce the same amount of output. If you're going to produce the same amount of economic output and you have productivity growth, then that also means that there's greater unemployment. So there's, fewer people needed to produce the same amount of stuff or services, right? So that can lead to unemployment. So in many ways, this lack of productivity growth might actually be supporting employment. So unemployment levels have been quite low in the likes of Australia, likes of US, likes of the UK for a number of years, and that has coincided with the lack of productivity growth as well. So maybe, that's in terms of employment, that can potentially have had a positive effect. But if you're going to be generating productivity growth, so if there's productivity growth, what that also means is that you need to generate extra growth. So you need to grow the pie itself in order to ensure that those people are then employed. So productivity growth also requires greater economic growth. And that can mean that you need to maximize economic growth. And that can mean, in the context of climate change, perhaps maybe that's not such a great thing, right? Especially given a lot of post-growth debates that we have touched on in this webinar previously as well. So I'm going to end there and give it back to Chelsea. Yeah.
Thanks, Dash. We'll come back to that growth component in the Q&A, I think, because that is one of these key elements contributing to a lot of these challenges and a key part of all of our research. So thank you very much. Last but not least, I'm going to now hand over to Professor Sharon Friel. She is the director of the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse to talk about health and health equity within the election and policy commitments. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea, and yeah, lovely to have the chance to speak with everybody. Just acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people's lands, paying respects to elders past and present. So why what Christian and Desh has just been telling us, what on earth does that have to do with planetary health equity, you might ask? The motivation for me in all of this is, why on earth do we continue to see the inequities in health outcomes here in Australia and globally? And that's what we are motivated by within the hothouse. So we speak about the equitable enjoyment of good health in a stable Earth system. They're both so completely interconnected. So I just want to sort of explain a little what Christian and Desh just described in terms of the targets, the policies that we've heard coming out from the Australian government. I could say nothing else and say planetary health equity is still very, very much at risk. Nothing that Christian and Desh just described is going to go any way to make it better. So why is that the case? You might have seen there was a very recent report come out from the World Health Organization, the report on global health equity. And I was very involved with that report. What that report really reaffirmed was the inequities, not the inequalities, the inequities, the unfair and avoidable differences in physical and mental health outcomes. That's the difference between the inequality and the inequity aspect. It's the unfairness part of it. We see that here in Australia and around the world. And what that WHO report reaffirmed was that those are caused not by medical care issues, they're caused by economic, by commercial, by environmental, and by social factors. So things like the asymmetrical and the environmentally harmful economic productivity growth that Desh was just speaking about, the inequality, the structural inequalities that exist in Australia, the harmful private sector practices and products like the fossil fuels, the coal and gas industries that we have in Australia, and that the norms and the values that are absolutely embedded and created by these entities within institutions, within the rules of the game. All of these things we know in the health equity world, they shape the conditions in which we are, and I put in inverted commas because this is the strapline from the report, in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And those things, those kind of everyday things, which are all shaped by the range of policies that we have in Australia affect our material resource. It affects our sense of control over our lives. It affects our sense of connectedness in society, and all of that gets under our skin, gets into our brains, and affects our health. And it's all very unequally distributed. So the sorts of actions that happen in economic policy, in housing policy, in labour policy, in energy policy, you might think they're so far away from health and health inequities, but actually they are fundamentally the policy areas, or many of the policy areas, that shape what happens to our physical and mental well-being. Please, when you think about health inequities, do not go to just thinking about medical care. So what's happening in Australia? What has happened in Australia as a consequence of the election? Let me again put it in terms of thinking about these issues of health and health inequities alongside climate change and inequality, or inequities more generally. Well, let's just think of what's just come out again from the World Health Organization. The World Health Assembly has been running for the past couple of weeks. That's the big governance mechanism for the WHO. We now have a global action plan on climate change and health, just approved through the World Health Assembly. That's a strategic framework that's all about supporting member states and the Secretariat for things: developing climate resilient, low carbon health systems. Fantastic, nowhere close enough to what we need. It's about strengthening surveillance and early warning systems when it comes to climate related disasters. Really important, really acute response mechanism, nowhere enough. Protecting vulnerable populations, and this is where I get really upset. People in and of themselves are not inherently vulnerable. All of those economic, social, environmental, economic conditions are what create risk for populations. So let's change the conditions in which populations live. And then, really importantly, integrating health into climate policy and financing mechanisms. So if you think of what Christian was telling us of, within the Labour government's promise to think about climate finance, there's such an opportunity now to bring health, well-being, I don't care what you call it, but improving the health of Australians and populations more widely. So there's an opportunity there. But here in Australia, we do have actually a national health and climate strategy that was in the sort of the previous round of the Labour government under the leadership of the Assistant Minister for Health, Jed Carney. And that really is fantastic. We're one of the few countries in the world that has such a strategy. But very sadly, it goes unfunded. So we have a dedicated unit within the Department of Health, which is again fantastic that we have that, a great group of colleagues that are pushing that forward. But it needs to be implemented and it needs to be funded properly. And there was no commitment to that in the election promises and since. We've had a change of minister for responsibility for that. So it's the assistant, still the Assistant Minister for Health, Rebecca White, a brand new minister from Tasmania. Importantly, she really values equality of opportunity. That's part of her language when she speaks, but she's brand new. Again, a real opportunity for engagement there. If Australia takes these issues seriously, I think this has to sit with Mark Butler. It has to sit with the lead senior health minister. It can't be just given to the assistant minister. So that would be one thing I think for us concerned about these relationships with climate and health is, Minister Butler, can you really take responsibility for this? There's discussion about bringing health into the climate adaptation plans. That's fantastic. Good adaptation policy actually, to me, is good social policy, and good social policy is really good health and health equity policy. But we need something similar when it comes to mitigation, and we don't have that in Australia at the moment. With the relationship with climate and health at the moment in Australia, the commitment from government is really just around thinking about the healthcare system and the greening of the healthcare system. Really good, but not sufficient. And currently, our nationally determined contributions, which sort of goes to the resetting of our targets that Christian was speaking about, but it sort of sets the direction for our mitigation or our adaptation policy. The analysis that we did in the hothouse shows that that's still predominantly kind of economics oriented rather than social or health focused. So just listening to what Christian and Desh laid out for us with policies that are going to think about energy and climate change, and policies that are going to think about structural inequities, I think we're still very far away from addressing anything to do with planetary health equity. I was just revisiting Mark Butler's book, which he wrote back in 2017 when he was the what was he? He was the shadow minister for climate change and energy at the time. And in the book, he said, and I quote, "Australia cannot afford to continue on this path." It was around the energy policy. Nothing's changed, as far as I can tell, in terms of that brave, real opportunity of reorienting the paradigm. You know, we're doing some research looking at paradigm shifts. We're still operating in a policy paradigm. The policy goal is not changing. It's still that productivity and growth, regardless actually of the environment, social or health costs. Growth is still primacy in this Labour government's policy commitments. We're tweaking the policy settings, we're tweaking the policy instruments, but ultimately we are not changing as a nation what it is we're aspiring to achieve. I hope this Labour government really takes the bull by the horns and sort of does do some of the things that it has said it would do in the past, because we need a spectrum of radical action, all the way from radical incrementalism through to full-blown system disruption. And hopefully in the conversation with the audience, we'll get some suggestions as to what that real action needs to look like that we can then all collectively feed back into this government. So thanks, Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Really interesting. I'm keen to get your sense, just building on that, about how the announced housing policies, kind of intersect with some of these ideas. You're talking about this idea of perpetual growth being a real challenge, but housing obviously being really essential for health and equity outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, the housing one, so again, some of the analysis that we did within the hothouse led by Nick Frank, so that was looking at this sort of conundrum of, so housing as a sector, construction, real estate, these are some of the big drivers of the economic growth model in Australia. So, of course, it's really an untouchable area, given how central it is to our growth model, or a difficult area to touch. We have one of our houses in Australia have the biggest environmental footprint. So really, the emissions are sort of embedded right in there. So that's a real problem. So we we drive housing. We've got all of the discussion going on now about, it's about supply. So we build more houses, we build a bigger footprint, and we've got all of the emissions associated with that. And then the inequality that Desh was sort of starting to touch with. Chronic financial stress associated with housing affordability, we know, is having a phenomenal impact on mental health across all age groups. But of course, it's going to have a very long tail impact in younger cohorts. And that chronic stress from financial stress is also associated with our physical health. We increase our cardiovascular disease risk when we have chronic stress as well. So housing policy really matters for physical and mental health, as well as for the environment.
Thank you. Okay, so audience, please pop in your questions. We're going to open it up to you guys pretty soon. But before we do that, I thought I'd really love to come back to you, Christian. You started kind of talking about the NDCs, the updated climate targets. Obviously, COP is coming up. Australia might be hosting next year, which is a pretty big deal. I wonder if you have any reflections on the likelihood of the ALP kind of using their mandate to really get ambitious on that target, and what that might look like in the next couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. So yeah, in my opening comments, I guess I was focusing on the domestic kind of side of the equation. The international, like COP, we haven't spoken about. So I'm sure most of you on the call know that there's these what's known as the Conference of the Parties, or the COPs. They take place every year. They're these international climate negotiations. We're up to COP31 now. I think the first COP was back in 1995 or something like that. So they've been going on for a while. Australia's never hosted them. And we're bidding to host COP31. That would be in 2026, the end of 2026. So there's only two remaining bidders, us and Turkey. I think we can assume that we will find out in June, July, probably late June at the Intersessional in Bonn, who the host party will be. The coalition had said, or Peter Dutton had said, that they wouldn't try and host the COP. So that's obviously one distinction that the Labor government has. And Chris Bowen, in particular, the Minister for Climate and Energy, has been quite vocal in wanting to host the COP, and I should say co-hosted with the Pacific. So part of the agenda is to co-host a COP with the Pacific to bring those voices in. This will be really interesting politically. On the one hand, it's a great opportunity for Australia to, hopefully put its best foot forward. I think there'll be considerable pressure from civil society groups and others for Australia to take a more ambitious approach. I think many of our allies in Europe will also want us to take perhaps a stronger approach than we have in the past. If we're to co-host it with the Pacific, then we already know that Pacific voices have been calling on Australia to stop supporting coal and gas projects for some time now. Countries like Vanuatu have gone a step further and signed on to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, etc. So I think we can expect public pressure here in Australia, international pressure, to ramp up, but the government's also going to have to navigate, I guess, the difficult relationships with the US that every country is facing, the trade regime collapsing in the background. So it's going to be a difficult COP to host, but it does give Australia the opportunity to put new things on the agenda. So you have the UNFCCC negotiations, which are kind of set in stone, and there's particular topics that come up, whether they're implementation or so on. You also have a parallel agenda known as the action agenda, and that's where the COP host, if it was to be Australia, could put forward big agenda items that it would like to get some movement on. And Sharon mentioned finance a moment ago. I think that's something that the Australian government could and might lean into, to try and mobilise new resources to ramp up the deployment of renewable energy, including in emerging economies. We might see something around green trade. Obviously, Australia, through the Future Made in Australia agenda, has been talking about green iron a lot. So there's a lot that Australia could use the COP as a platform to push ambitious things in the climate space. I mean, I really hope that does happen, but of course we won't see anything publicly, I think, until June, July, when it's determined whether Australia or Turkey will be the ultimate host. But I think most people would be betting on Australia as the most likely at this point in time.
I'm going to be a very organized chair and wrap us up. We're almost a couple of minutes away from finish time. I want to have everyone join me in thanking Desh, Sharon, and Christian for sharing their expert insights on post-election. I'll just mention to the audience, Amy's been kind enough to pop in some information in the chat, but you can check out upcoming Hothouse events on our website, hothouse.anu.edu.au/events. Our next one's coming up on the 19th of June, where Professor Fran Baum will be discussing how alienation stemming from 21st century capitalism impacts health. Thanks all very much, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.